My daughter begged me not to leave her alone with my sister, and I made her go anyway. My daughter Gracie has been in a wheelchair since she was 4 years old after a car accident severed her spinal cord, and my sister has spent 3 years telling anyone who will listen that Gracie is faking it for attention. We drove 6 hours to my father's lake house for his 70th birthday because I couldn't say no to him, even though I knew my sister would be there. The first night at dinner, my nephew jabbed Gracie's legs with a fork under the table, and my sister's eyes lit up when Gracie flinched. She grabbed my father's arm and said, "Did you see that? She flinched. She can feel." Gracie's voice got small as she tried to explain that she saw the fork coming. She didn't feel it, and my sister rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. My parents laughed nervously, and my mother said, "He's just curious about how it all works. Leave him alone." I watched Gracie's face crumble as she realized nobody was going to protect her. The next morning, I found Gracie sobbing on the hallway floor in wet pajamas because someone had taken her wheelchair while she slept, and she tried to drag herself to the bathroom but didn't make it in time. My nephew was standing in the doorway laughing, and my sister was right behind him with this satisfied smile on her face as she said, if she could really feel her legs, she would have held it. That's basic biology. I looked at my parents, and they just looked away like they hadn't heard anything, and I cleaned Gracie up and whispered to my husband, "We're leaving first thing in the morning." The next day, I was loading the car while Gracie waited on the front porch in her wheelchair, and I ran inside to grab our last bag, and that's when I heard her scream. I sprinted back outside and found my nephew standing behind Gracie's wheelchair at the top of the porch steps with both hands still on the handles. Gracie was tilted backward about 2 seconds from tumbling down 8 concrete stairs headfirst. I lunged forward and grabbed the chair and pulled her back onto solid ground, and my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. My sister came out and said, "Oh, calm down. He barely touched her. You're being ridiculous." I said he almost killed her, and my father stepped between us and said, "Let's not be dramatic here. It was clearly just an accident." My nephew was smirking behind him like he knew exactly what he'd done, and Gracie was shaking as she whispered, "Please, I want to go home." I said, "We're leaving right now," and started pushing Gracie toward the car when my sister ran up crying and begging me to wait. She said she just wanted 5 minutes alone with Gracie to apologize, just a quick walk to the dock to make peace before we left. Gracie immediately said no and tried to grab my hand, but my sister started crying harder and said, "I'm trying to make this right and you won't even let me say I'm sorry." My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Just let her apologize. What's 5 minutes going to hurt?" I was exhausted and I just wanted it to be over, so I looked down at Gracie and said, "It's only 5 minutes and then we never have to see them again." Gracie looked up at me with tears in her eyes and her face crumbled as my sister grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and started pushing her toward the lake. My nephew followed close behind them and I went inside to get the last of our things. I heard screaming 30 seconds later and ran outside, and Gracie's wheelchair was sitting empty at the edge of the dock. Gracie was face down in the water and she wasn't moving. I sprinted down the dock and dove in and flipped her over, and her lips were already turning blue. I dragged her back to the dock and my father helped pull her up onto the wood, and she wasn't breathing at all. I started doing CPR and I was pressing on her chest over and over and nothing was happening, and all I could think was, this is how I lose her. This is how my baby dies. Then Gracie coughed and water came pouring out of her mouth and she started gasping and crying, and I held her so tight I thought I might crush her. My father grabbed my nephew and screamed, "What did you do?" My nephew backed away with his hands up and said, "It wasn't me. I swear to God it wasn't me." My father shook him and screamed, "Don't lie to me." My nephew was sobbing as he said, "I'm not lying. I was going to do it, but I couldn't." And then Mom shoved past me and pushed her in herself. My father let go of him and turned to my sister. She was standing there with her arms crossed and she said, "Her legs kicked. I told you she was faking." My father screamed, "She almost died." My sister looked genuinely confused and said, "Why is everyone so upset when I was right? Gracie hasn't slept through the night since, and she keeps asking me if she did something to make her aunt hate her so much."